All right, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking again about borderline personality disorder, or BPD, as we cover the book I Hate You, Don't Leave Me by Dr. Jerold Kreisman and Hal Staus. So last week we just did a video on Perfect Blue. If you haven't seen that, check it out. One of my favorite videos that I've made so far. And we discussed quite a bit this idea of BPD, what it entails, how that may present. And this book is one of the most widely recognized books on the topic. So we're going to jump into that, discuss the book. I'm going to give you some further recommendations at the end. But first, some general facts about the book. The original edition, so the first edition was actually published in 1989. So it's been around for decades. And this is the third edition, which was published as recently as 2021. So covering quite a span of time there in their updates of the book. And it's written again by a psychiatrist, that's Dr. Kreisman, and then Hal Staus, which has published multiple books in the medical space. So it's become a resource for both clinicians and lay people, such as family members or those struggling with BPD, trying to understand the disorder more fully. So many different people approach this book, and we'll talk about that. And I would also say that it just tries, its aim is to demystify this disorder, which is represented, as we just mentioned, in film, in all kinds of different media. The chances are that you know someone who struggles with BPD, or at least has aspects of a borderline characterological organization. So we'll talk about all of these things. Overall, my goal for this video is to review the criteria for BPD as a baseline, just to refresh your memory or to tell you for the first time, to give you a better idea of how the DSM defines the disorder. We'll discuss this set-up technique that the book focuses on quite heavily. I will also offer several of my critiques of the book. And then at the end, I'll give you some alternative recommendations for other books if you want to delve deeper into this topic and have a more well-rounded understanding of borderline personality disorder. So let's jump into it. So as I just mentioned, this disorder is common enough that either you personally or someone you know struggles with the disorder, properly speaking, as in they could meet criteria for diagnosis, or just aspects of it that tend to play into this, like patterns of behavior. And as we'll talk about further later on, ego defenses even that are commonly employed or used by individuals who suffer with this disorder. So we'll talk about all of that, but let's start with a general overview of how the DSM defines the disorder. What criteria would someone need to actually meet to be diagnosed with this disorder, properly speaking? And that gives us a solid baseline, a solid foundation to, build our conceptual understanding of this around. Borderline personality disorder, or BPD, is marked by instability in personal relationships, a view of the self, affect, or say emotions, and marked impulsivity. As is the case with all personality disorders, this is present early in life and is relatively stable throughout life. This idea of the stability, though, we'll talk about to some degree. It's somewhat of a separate conversation, but as I've mentioned before, it is true that personality traits are relatively stable, but I don't want anyone to come away from this video with the idea that they're immutable or unchangeable, because that is quite literally the goal of treatment when it comes to disordered personalities, is to change it over time. And if we start from the outset by saying, well, these things can't be changed, they're set in stone, I think that's to some degree ridiculous. And from another perspective, it's counterintuitive to what we're trying to do here. So it can be changed, and it may take a lot of time and effort, but it is relatively stable. That is true. So quite specifically, the DSM notes that 5 or more of the following 9 criteria must be present to meet diagnosis for borderline personality disorder. So let's go through those criteria and then we'll move on from there. 1, frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. 2, a pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. This is also known as splitting. 3, identity disturbance, markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. 4, impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging, such as spending too much money, sexual promiscuity, substance abuse, so on and so forth. 5, recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures or threats or self-harm. 6, affective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood. So this is essentially really unstable emotions and emotional extremes. We could put it in other words that way. 7, chronic feelings of emptiness. 8, inappropriate, intense anger or difficulty controlling anger. 9, transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. These symptoms, this cluster of symptoms, does not just express the emotional volatility aspect of the disorder, but also interpersonal issues, problems with boundaries, and again, an issue with having a stable sense of self across time. Now, back to our review of this book, the topic of this video. It has been praised for how accessible it is. Again, it's been reviewed by clinicians as well as lay people. But on that same note, I found that it does in fact cover a lot of ground in a relatively short amount of time, but it's quite surface level. So you get kind of an overview of many different aspects of the disorder, how to approach it, how someone might feel, how you might engage with them in therapy, all of these different things. And it's all quite surface level. But if you're coming into this from the perspective of not knowing much about the disorder, then I think reading this book would be worth your time, because you're going to walk away with a bit of a better understanding what the disorder is, how it may present, how it's dealt with in treatment, all of these sorts of things. If you're a clinician with a bit more experience, then you may not walk away having gained much from the book. I can tell you personally, just an honest review, after reading the book, I don't quite feel like I learned anything new or had anything added to my perspective on the disorder. But after reading it, I can say that it is likely useful for a lot of people. I think that it seems geared more particularly towards lay people, in my opinion. I think it would be quite useful for someone who has maybe been recently diagnosed with this disorder and wants to understand what that means a bit more fully, or someone who's questioning whether or not they would meet criteria for this disorder, or family members of someone who is struggling with BPD. I think that these are all examples where this book would be accessible, as we've said, and useful. Again, it covers a wide variety of topics such as neurobiology, psychodynamic approaches, diagnostic criteria, and treatment options. But it does so at quite an introductory level. So I tell you all this just so that you can decide based on your level of current understanding if you think that this book would be worth it for you to read, if it would be worth your time, essentially. And again, at the end of this video, I'll offer several recommendations for other books that you can read if you really want to dive in quite a bit deeper and have a more full understanding of the disorder. Let's take some time now to go over one of the main techniques that this book champions and that it returns to quite often throughout the chapters. And that's this idea of the set up technique. So SETUP, and that is for support, empathy, truth, understanding, and perseverance. And I'll go through each of those. Support involves reassuring the individual that you care about them and that you're committed to the relationship. Empathy involves offering them some sort of statement that conveys you are empathizing and that you respect the emotions that they're experiencing, whether or not you agree with their interpretation of what's going on. Truth is more of a confrontational aspect where you're giving them your interpretation of the reality of the situation and stating that. Understanding is more about your own understanding of the psychology behind their way of thinking and their patterns of behavior. And perseverance is a further reminder that this process of healing and of working through this disorder and hopefully resolving it to the degree that you wouldn't necessarily consider someone as suffering from the disorder per se, is going to take a lot of perseverance. It's going to take a lot of time and effort to really make progress. And so they lay out this technique of remembering, set up, SETUP, and how to use that to formulate responses to, say, more borderline individuals as a sort of middle road when they're splitting between two extreme options that they see as the way forward, and you're saying, no, we're going to take this middle road. I'm going to use this set up technique to organize my response to you, to organize what I'm going to say. I'm going to support, empathize, and offer a statement about the truth of the situation. And all the while, I'm going to remember to understand your way of thinking and to understand personally that this is going to take a lot of perseverance for us to work through. So overall, it's essentially a way to keep boundaries, appropriate boundaries, while remaining present and supportive for someone, perhaps a loved one or a family member that struggles with BPD. Could certainly be useful. Whether or not you approach it in that particular order or think about it in terms of the acronym, it's generally good advice. I also wanted to take the time to discuss the myriad therapy modalities discussed briefly in the book. Chapter 8 in particular briefly gives an overview of the following modalities, including CBT, DBT, STEPPS, SFT, TFP, MBT, GPM, DDP, ABT, ISTDP, and ICE. All different acronyms for different modalities of therapy. And a striking example would be that of good psychiatric management, or GPM, which the book emphasizes that this modality of therapy offers an emphasis on offering psychoeducation and being thoughtful. And I just wanted to ask you, do you think that being thoughtful is a particularly unique aspect of that particular modality of therapy, or is that universal to therapy or even life overall? In my view personally, all these different modalities of therapy appear to be attempts to formalize and highlight distinct aspects of therapy as a whole. Again, my opinion, but all these different modalities seem to be attempts for particular clinicians or institutions to canonize their individual styles or approaches to therapy, as though they want to establish a named tradition. But my opinion is that fundamentally, good therapy relies on the clinician's understanding of the fundamentals of what makes the talking cure worthwhile in the first place. It's these essential principles that make it effective. In creating all these new acronyms, I don't think necessarily add anything of value to the practice. Therapy in general is this dynamic interplay between support and confrontation. And each individual patient is going to need different levels of both, presented in different ways at different times. And so at that point, we could say that every instance of therapy with each individual patient is different in various ways, and we could name each individual therapy based on the name of the client or the patient themselves. Now, further critique I have of the book is that it often overgeneralizes, and considering that, in my view, this is geared more towards lay people, I think this could be a problem if people walk away from the book with an even more vague understanding of what BPD is and apply it too liberally to all kinds of different issues and personality structures. This comes up particularly when the book offers these little clinical vignettes. So it offers these little blurbs on different patients, and it's implicit that these patients that are being described are all suffering with BPD. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I'll give you an example. This is from page 166, for example, and I'll just read it to you verbatim. It says, Larry, for example, was in a marriage that was comfortably boring. Married for over 20 years, he and his wife Phyllis rarely interacted. She reared their sons while Larry toiled for a large company. His life was a self-imposed prison of daily routine and compulsive behaviors. He took hours to dress in order to arrange his clothing just so. At night before bed, he engaged in rituals to maintain a sense of control. The closet doors had to be opened in a special way, the bathroom sink had to be carefully cleaned, and the soap and toilet articles arranged in a certain pattern. So let me ask you, does that vignette strike you as particularly borderline? Do you think it sounds reasonable that a borderline individual would be in a comfortably boring marriage for 20 years and rarely have interaction with their spouse? Do all of these rituals that must be done and take up significant amounts of time sound like BPD to you, or does it sound maybe like OCD to you? And again, it's implicit when they present this vignette that this is someone suffering with BPD, and it's too overgeneralized. They're, I think, trying to describe with these different vignettes different ego defense mechanisms, some more primitive defense mechanisms, those that are often employed in BPD and used by people with more borderline personality organization, but it's not exclusive to BPD. And if someone walks away from this book thinking that, oh, pretty much anything abnormal is borderline, I think that's a problem that the media contributes to already. So I would expect this book to be more careful in its approach in trying to stay away from leaving people with that impression. And so on that note, these primitive ego defense mechanisms and other topics that I think are really important to understanding BPD and how to approach it aren't fully addressed. Well, they aren't really ever fully addressed, but they aren't really even mentioned or given an overview until the appendix of the book. In many ways, it wasn't until the appendix A and B, that I felt the book was covering a lot of important material. And a lot of people may read the book, get to the appendix and say, I'm not reading that. I already read the book, the actual book itself, and be done with it, and they may never see it. So it wasn't really until the appendix that we started talking about things like the evolution of the history of the disorder per se, talking about it from Freud to Kernberg and so on, talking about different diagnostic approaches to diagnosing BPD. All these different things I think are really important to one's understanding of the disorder, what it really means, where this idea came from. And it wasn't addressed until Appendix A and B. So I think that definitely should have been integrated into the bulk of the book so that people would be less likely to miss it. And so again, while I Hate You, Don't Leave Me as a book offers a broad overview of the disorder, it sacrifices depth for breadth. Now, as I promised, I have some recommendations. For those of you who want to understand more deeply the underpinnings of a borderline character organization, I really have to recommend Nancy McWilliams' Psychoanalytic Diagnosis. This book is so valuable, in my opinion, and it gives a great overview of different ego defenses. It talks about these different personality structures, how they're organized. It gives so much rich information. So if you want to understand on a deeper level, I have to recommend this book. I have a video on it as well. Now, further, I have a recommendation that's less technical in its approach, I guess you could say, from one perspective, but it really offers a rich narrative over the long term of working with a patient that has borderline personality disorder, and that is Alexander Chris's book, Borderline: The Biography of a Personality Disorder. I also have a video on this book. This book is as informative as it is entertaining. So I would definitely recommend this if you want to read about his experience over the long term. We're talking years working with a borderline patient from their first encounter to making a lot of progress really with that patient. And lastly, as a bit of a bonus, I really wanted to mention this book, Personality Disorders by Horwitz. This book gives you an overview of how the 10 personality disorders that are described in the DSM came to be in the first place. And I think that does a couple things. I think that on one hand, it really attenuates your approach to diagnosing these personality disorders as something that someone has, right? I think it's something that helps you come to a more appropriate understanding of what having a personality disorder really means. You know, how are these defined in the first place? Where are these definitions coming from? And is this something that someone really has, or is this a learned pattern of behavior when it comes to their interactions with their social and even physical environment? And on the other hand, I think that it in some ways bolsters your appreciation for the DSM and for the defined personality disorders, because you see for how many decades all these different people have quite literally toiled to come to a conclusion on what constitutes a personality disorder, which personality disorders should be defined as separate disorders, the differences between them, all these different things. So it's really worth your while, particularly I think if you're a clinician, to understand the history behind this, and this book helps with that. And so that is I Hate You, Don't Leave Me. Again, I would recommend this book if you are looking for a more general understanding of the disorder. I think it's quite useful for that. But as I mentioned, I would be careful about overgeneralizing and walking away from this book with an idea that anything abnormal is borderline. That is incorrect. Also, check out my video on Nancy McWilliams' book, Psychoanalytic Diagnosis, or Alexander Chris's book, Borderline, if you're interested in hearing a bit more about those. And as always, I appreciate your time watching these videos, hanging out with me. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.